Welcome to Critical Junction, episode 45. I'm Mark.
Oh, I'm Luke.
I'm Jill.
And joining us today for our second installment of our great debate series is Matt Semrau. Welcome, Matt. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So this episode has been kind of in the works for a few months now. Matt, you and I have gone back and forth on social media about this very issue twice, I think it was, over the past maybe a year, I think, but I'm not sure.
Maybe 6 months.
Yeah, so I'm not going to bring any of that up. We're just going to go fresh and talk about what we talk about today, just so we don't poison the well. So let's get to it. In 1988, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled the existing provision on abortion within the Criminal Code violated a woman's right to life, liberty, and security of the person, guaranteed under Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, with the Chief Justice Brian Dixon writing, quote, "Forcing a woman by threat of criminal sanction to carry a fetus to term unless she meets certain criteria unrelated to her own priorities and aspirations is a profound interference with a woman's body and thus a violation of her security of the person." A few years earlier, across the border in the famous 1973 Roe v. Wade case, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a Texas law banning abortion, arguing that a woman's right to an abortion was implicit in the right to privacy protected under the 14th Amendment, which effectively legalized the procedure across the country. More recently, earlier this year, the Republic of Ireland voted overwhelmingly to overturn the country's existing abortion ban by a margin of 66.4 to 33.6%. As it stood, abortion was only permitted in cases where a woman's life was at risk, but not in cases of rape, incest, or fatal fetal anomaly. All of these precedents, among others set by several other countries, are in keeping with the conclusion drawn by a research paper authored by Marge Berer, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who, citing no less than 57 objective, independently verifiable sources, writes, quote, "The plethora of convoluted laws and restrictions on abortion do not make any legal or public health sense. What makes abortion safe is simple and irrefutable, when it is available on the woman's request and is universally affordable and accessible. From this perspective, few existing laws are fit for purpose," end quote. A 2017 study by the Guttmacher Institute drew a similar conclusion, stating, quote, "Highly restrictive laws do not eliminate the practice of abortion, but make those that do occur more likely to be unsafe. In these countries, improving the quality and coverage of post-abortion care, which all countries accept as an essential reproductive health service that they must provide, is crucial to saving lives and protecting women's health," end quote. Yet, despite all these precedents and the assessment of countless experts, there are still those who oppose a woman's right to choose. The issue of abortion comes down to a question not only of public health, but also of rights over bodily autonomy. Pregnancy is undeniably a physical condition that happens to a woman's body, and since women have, without question, the right to control their own body, it follows that no one has the right to force a woman to remain pregnant against her will and without her consent. So, my question for Matt is simply, why do you oppose abortion?
Oh, it's a very simple statement. For the pro-choice crowd, and you'll notice this with the pro-life crowd as well, that both people tend to frame their argument in such a way that the other is opposed to a sort of straw man position. For a pro-choice crowd, it's always going to come up as they're against women, or they're against women's choice, or a woman's right to body autonomy. But for a pro-life crowd, the question is always going to come back to is that human beings inherently have rights, regardless of whether they're male or female. And ending those rights and ending someone's life against their will is strictly unethical, and something that, as a society, we find morally apprehensive and would never want to wish on anybody. So simply saying it is a woman's right to choose doesn't hold a lot of weight for people who are in a pro-life crowd. In the same way that a murderer who walks in and guns down 12 people in a grocery store can't say that it is simply my body and my right to choose to do with it as I will. Once it is someone else's body and you inflict bodily harm, willful or otherwise, on someone else, it is no longer your right under the law to act in such a manner. And I think it's a fairly straightforward argument to make. Okay,
so are you equating abortion with murder in that case? Is that the essence of the argument that you're making? I don't want to strawman you. I'm just asking the question to clarify it.
Murder is a interesting term to use. Murder can get twisted and turned into a lot of different ways, but as long as it is the ending of someone else's life, then yes, I absolutely think it is murder.
Okay, so I have a couple of problems with that right away. First of all, by definition, abortion is the termination of the physical condition we refer to as pregnancy, which has, as a side effect, the cessation of life of the fetus. Okay, but even all that taken into consideration, that's irrelevant to the position that I hold. Because abortion, like I said, is the termination of the physical condition that we call pregnancy. So the question becomes one not of whether or not we're killing something, but rather, are we letting something die? Which are two distinctly separate issues.
I wouldn't say so at all. A lot of people make the argument that an abortion and cesarean section are the exact same thing. But
they are the same thing. Like a C-section is a late-term abortion. It is the termination of a pregnancy.
Not at all.
Yes, it is. By definition, you are terminating the pregnancy by removing the infant or baby or fetus or whatever from the woman, thus terminating the pregnancy.
A large majority of abortions don't simply involve removing a child from a womb. They often involve tearing a child to pieces or euthanizing the child in some way before taking it out to minimize the risk of any kind of structural damage. And in the cases of killing a child before removing it, then that is absolutely not the same as simply taking it out. It's like people saying that putting your dog down and twisting its limbs off and crushing its head are the same thing. You might be willingly ending its life, but to call both of those things euthanasia is a bit of a strange line to draw.
Again, I take issue with killing because if we accept the definition of abortion as it stands, the termination of a pregnancy, it is not the active killing of the fetus. The cessation of life of the fetus is the side effect of that procedure, right?
In that particular case, a large number of abortions that are performed do not fit your description of abortions.
In what way?
In the way that I described earlier. That a large number of abortions involve actively tearing apart or killing the child before removing it from a woman.
It's still the termination of the pregnancy, though.
Well, indeed. You can terminate parenthood by killing children.
So are you suggesting that abortion is killing children, then?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think we need to make a distinction and understand at what point do you consider the thing growing inside a woman to be a child?
Where's the line drawn? I guess I'm wondering. I'm curious.
Certainly.
Because it seems to be really just a different line drawn.
Mm-hmm. I think that's where a lot of people have a strong distinction about. I mean, after all, if a fetus is nothing more than a pile of goo, similar to a cancerous tumor, then obviously no one would have any problem taking for someone getting rid of it or terminating it. There's obviously no groups that are out there holding up placards demanding that women are not allowed to have cancer treatment or have tumors removed. So it comes down to whether or not a fetus is a human baby or not. Very obviously, it is alive, since killing it is the problem. And from a medical standpoint, we consider someone to be alive. We consider their life to end once their heart stops. And the baby's heart starts
That's not
at
true.
22 days.
We consider something to be dead when the brain ceases to function.
The brain ceases to function after it gets the blood flowing from the heart, but there's a reason why we don't hook up people to brain scans before pronouncing them dead. Once their heart stops beating, we pronounce them dead.
Brain death is the determination.
We still don't hook people up to brain machines in order to determine whether or not they're dead. We don't use that as the metric. We use whether or not their heart stops beating for a significant amount of time. That's the standard practice in the medical field.
Do you have anything?
Not yet, no.
Not yet? All right. So,
But regardless of that point, it then comes back to when does the human life begin?
right.
And it's a very simple question to answer. An egg on its own is not enough to constitute human DNA, and neither is a sperm on its own enough to constitute an individual human DNA. In the same way that you can take genetic information from a tree or a dog and compare it with a person, it's very easy to immediately recognize that one of them is a human being and the others are not. In the case of a fetus, from an incredibly young age, we're talking days, you can extract that genetic information and determine that this is a human being, that it is its own separate human being, and that it is not simply part of the mother, and is not simply part of a father either, but that it is their own individual human being. So you've determined that they're human using science, and you've determined as well that they are alive, since they meet the
So
qualifications
I think you're equivocating between the terms human being, and person.
Is there a difference between a human being and a person?
Yes.
What is the difference?
Philosophers and bioethicists have not been able to determine what constitutes a person. So simply asserting that a fetus is a person that's a pretty arrogant standpoint to hold if throughout history philosophers have not been able to answer that question. So how do you answer that question?
I'd like to hear more about what you have to say that philosophers have not been able to answer what a human is.
No, I said person.
Person.
Oh.
Sure, but I would like you to, for my own benefit,
We're
explain
talking
more
about consciousness here, or
That's the problem. Like, is it consciousness that determines personhood? Is it biology? Is it something else? Is it a combination of all these factors? This has been a question that's been plaguing philosophers for centuries. And most recently in bioethics, the reason why we don't permit late-term abortions beyond 21 or 24 weeks is because of the gradualist approach that philosophers and bioethicists have taken, right? They at the 21 or 24 week point, the fetus resembles a human to the extent that we can't simply say it's not a person at that point. But beyond that, it's the gradualist approach that a lot of people take is that as the fetus develops, it gradually accumulates characteristics of personhood. But there is no one stop or one specific point where you can say, now it's a person. So to err on the side of caution, we don't allow late-term abortions beyond 21 or 24 weeks, just to simply get around that problem. It's a consensus because the issue is so complicated.
But that 21-week point, it's not just determined...
No, by then it's viability. So
viability
right,
is what is
right.
usually
Yeah, exactly.
kind of counted on there.
Yeah, so they're counting on the aspect of viability in order to say, okay, well now, unless you have a very, very good reason, we can't perform the procedure. So to assert that a fetus is a person is an arrogant position.
I still don't feel that's an arrogant position.
So what gives you the right to determine that a fetus is a person if all these experts and all these philosophers and all these bioethicists and doctors and scientists can't answer it?
Well, quite simply, I'd still like you to explain the position. You're saying that a lot of people say that that personhood is difficult to define,
right,
and that we don't know the boundaries of what constitutes personhood.
Right.
The only thing you mentioned is that around 22 weeks that it is very easy to see that it looks like a person.
Right, and that's also the viability thing.
Right, but I want you to continue that statement. You're saying that it is arrogant to disagree with this point. But
I didn't say it's arrogant to disagree with it. I said it's arrogant to assert that a fetus is a person because we have not been able to answer that question with any kind of certainty.
So you're saying that you don't know what a person is?
That's exactly right. I can't make that determination. So why do you?
Quite simply, if, let's say the very oft example that gets used a lot is if you're driving down the road in your car and something that steps out in front of the car looks like a person, do you hit the brakes or not? And most people, I would assume, would err on the side of caution, regardless of self-harm, that if it's possibly a person, they're not going to take the risk killing it. And if you can't answer that you don't know whether or not it's a person, then morally you're in a position where you should not err on the side of killing it.
Well, then, let me rephrase. I do not know when a fetus becomes a person.
Precisely, because you don't have any particular boundaries to determine when something becomes a person.
You can objectively, in the case that you're presenting, you can objectively determine that something or someone is a person because they're an individual entity that you can identify, right? In your specific example. Okay? When it comes to a fetus, we can't make that determination. They are entirely dependent on the mother to survive and subsist. Okay?
Well, so is an infant.
No, they're entirely dependent on the mother's body in order to survive or subsist.
Certainly. But that doesn't mean that they don't have their own genetic information, which is how we determine
Genetic
whether or not
information
something
is irrelevant to the question.
How so?
Because it keeps coming back to the definition of abortion being the termination of the pregnancy, not the killing of the fetus. Okay? So personhood in this regard is irrelevant. And even if you want to introduce the idea of personhood, you're raising an entirely new problem. Right? Now you have two people whose rights are in conflict. You have person A, the mother, who has the right to bodily autonomy. And if you want to extend your argument to say that the fetus has a right to life and the fetus is a person, that person does not have the right to live at the expense of the mother's body without her consent. Let me ask you this question. So let's say there's an infant, and it needs a kidney transplant in order to survive, or to survive.
Okay.
Is the mother obligated, or does anyone have the right to force the mother to donate that kidney to the child?
Obviously, we don't have any laws that would force someone to take a piece of their own body and give it to someone else. No.
Exactly. So, what's the difference?
Well, hold on.
Why are you...
Here we're just talking about laws.
Hold on. Why are you trying to assign special rights to the fetus?
Because, although you don't find my grounds for determining it both human and alive to be necessary for personhood, I think it's
No,
still...
I didn't say it's not necessary to personhood. I said it's irrelevant to the question.
I don't think it is relevant to the question.
So again, we come back to the idea that we have two people whose rights are in conflict. How do you determine which one of them to assign those rights to?
Quite simply. If two people are in conflict, let's use the example of someone walking out into the
No,
road.
let's use this example that we're dealing
It
with.
makes perfect sense. Whether or not you're forced to hit the brakes or not, you have your own body autonomy.
Let's use the example that we're dealing with.
Sure.
Why does the fetus get special rights to live at the expense of the mother's body without her consent?
There's two problems, first of all, with consent. Firstly, no act of sex, with the exception of rape, is an act in which a child has mysteriously fallen out of the sky upon someone.
Consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy.
That's a rather absurd claim to make.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. Absolutely not. If you're consenting to sex, that doesn't necessarily, by definition, mean that you're consenting to get pregnant or to get someone else pregnant.
For someone to consent to sex, they're consenting to a risk that pregnancy is going to happen, unless perhaps they haven't gone through, I don't know, grade 6 biology and aren't aware that that is what makes babies.
But supposing that someone had taken all the necessary precautions in order to avoid getting pregnant and still accidentally ends up doing so. Again, consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. She has the right to terminate that pregnancy because it's unwanted.
Not to mention that consent can be withdrawn at any time. There's no obligation that once you've given consent once, that has to hold forever. So like if you're in a romantic relationship, let's say, it's not because you consented to having sex once that the other partner in the relationship can claim sex from the first partner indefinitely, right?
Right. And if you're suggesting that, you know, the woman has an obligation toward that child, at what point does that obligation end?
I think one of the things that you're going to on your argument is the fact that it's, quite honestly, not fair that women can get pregnant as a result of sex that's meant for enjoyment and are then responsible for carrying another life. And it is unfortunate that they are the ones who have to bear that burden 100% of the time, since males are biologically incapable of doing it. But that doesn't mean that a woman's right to her own body autonomy trumps something else's right to live. In particular case of another human's.
Right, but what I keep getting back to is the fact that nobody has the right to live at the expense of someone else's body without their express consent. If the woman does not consent to have that child take advantage of her body and keep going, she has every right to say no to that.
I don't think that's a fair comparison, because that child...
It's not a comparison,
is so
it's just a matter of fact, right? If the woman does not wish to be pregnant and does not wish the fetus to carry on taking advantage of her body in order to keep going, her rights exist.
Certainly a woman's rights exist, so I absolutely agree with you, 100%. That you should not be allowed to force a woman to become pregnant, and you should not...
No, I said you shouldn't force a woman to remain pregnant against her will without her express consent.
Well, so why does that trump the rights then of someone else's right to live?
Because someone does not have the right to live at the expense of someone else's body. Plain and simple. Just like with the kidney example that I gave you, right? The person's right to life ends when that person says, no, I will not donate a kidney so that you can continue living. It is my right to refuse you to take advantage of my body for your right to live. Then it becomes, again, a question of letting something die rather than killing it.
There's a very strong difference.
By refusing to donate a kidney, you are letting something die. You're not killing it.
Not at all. Because the procedure requires a medical intervention.
I'm talking about the kidney example.
Exactly.
Right.
So for donating a kidney. You're using the example of forcing someone to donate a kidney is identical to abortion.
Didn't say identical, it's just a comparison.
No, but the comparison you're making, a more apt one, would be that just because you're not forced to donate a kidney to the child, it doesn't mean that you can take a knife to slit the kid's throat or to chop them into pieces.
And that's not at all what I'm saying.
But the right to abortion is the right to be able to do those things.
The right to abortion is the right to terminate a pregnancy, plain and simple. By definition, that is what it is.
You're playing fast and loose with semantics.
It's not, well, semantics are important because we have to understand the terms. The term abortion simply, by definition, means the termination of a pregnancy.
That's a very strange line to draw when terminating a you can terminate a pregnancy by simply removing a child from a body.
Yeah.
That is not, and saying like, well, it's not able to survive on its own, I guess it dies. That is not the same thing as euthanizing a child or tearing a child to pieces when they're inside of a mother and then removing it. Would you then agree that all abortions, with the exception of safely removing the child, that all other scenarios, with the exception of safely removing the child, so all other scenarios that involve the euthanization of the child, of the killing of the child while it's inside of the womb, of the tearing it to pieces and crushing the skull and then removing it piece by piece. So you would then admit that all of those other ones either don't count as abortion or are not acceptable.
No, neither of them. I don't care if the child is in there reciting Shakespeare and writing opera. Mm-hmm. The simple fact is it does not have the right to continue living at the expense of the woman unless she consents to it.
Why not?
Because the right to life ends where someone else's body begins.
But the woman participated in creating that life.
So what?
So you're saying that in a sense that is an unwritten contract, that she is agreeing now that I may possibly become pregnant, and if I do, I have the kid.
Is it a matter of taking responsibility, in your opinion, then?
I think anyone who engages in sex at any point in their life is well aware of the risks that are involved if they don't want to have a child. I suppose saying it as sort of an unwritten contract would be one way of putting it, because in any scenario, people understand that they'll mitigate the risks as much as they can, but it doesn't make them impossible.
Right. So, sorry, I didn't follow the end of your argument there.
So that means that having a child doesn't mean that you have the right to that child's life to do with whatever you please. A good way of putting it is you say that it's the confliction between the two individuals' rights, the child's right to live and the mother's right to bodily autonomy. Your right to bodily autonomy in an act that you willingly engaged in does not trump someone else's right to life.
No, but again, the right to life ends where someone else's body begins. Plain and simple. Nobody has the right to continue living at the expense of someone else's body. That's just simply true.
But why not?
Because you don't, right? Because
I think it becomes a social contract, is it not?
It's not really a social contract. It's just I don't want you using my body to continue living. That's just it. I'm not gonna, if I don't want to donate blood to save your life, I'm not going to. Mm-hmm. Right? The same kind of logic applies when it comes to pregnancy. So, if the woman does not wish to remain pregnant, that is entirely her choice.
I don't think that's necessarily a strong comparison to make. Look at the example of someone who visits a crash scene for an accident on the road. If you begin performing CPR on someone, you are legally obligated to continue performing CPR until proper first responders arrive on the scene. Once you've begun an action that you now have someone's life in your hands, once you've taken someone's life into your hands, your own preference and your own choice goes out the window. Now their life becomes paramount. Once you have made the choice to take the person's life into your hands.
The person upon whom you're performing CPR is not dependent on your body.
Absolutely they are.
They're not. They're not hooked up to you in any kind of physical way. They're not dependent on your body. They're dependent on the action you are performing.
And you can pass that action on to somebody else.
Yeah, you can absolutely pass that action on to somebody else. Pregnancy is not an action. Pregnancy is a physical condition.
Certainly. So in that case, what you're arguing for is that it is unlawful to kill a kid, but it's okay for a woman to decide to stop, let's say, giving nutrients to support a child's life.
No, I'm saying she has the right to not be pregnant.
So she has the right. So what you're saying is that if a child is viable, then it can be safely removed, then that is considered another person, and that you can't unlawfully kill them, right?
Is that what I'm saying? No. The only thing I'm saying is that a woman has every right to decide whether or not she wishes to remain pregnant. And nobody can tell her otherwise.
I disagree with that. I think a human's right to life is paramount over someone else's choice, over what they do with their own body.
So the scenarios you guys have been discussing sound a lot like a pretty famous one by someone named Judith Jarvis Thompson. You probably heard of it.
I'm not familiar with the name, but I've probably heard of the example, I'm sure.
Okay, so the example, it's called the violinist example. So the situation is that imagine that you wake up one morning not knowing like what happened the night before, and you wake up and in the bed right next to you is some famous violinist, and you were found to be the only person by some group of people that were trying to protect or to save this famous violinist. You were found to be the only person who was compatible and who could keep this guy alive by actually having you hooked up to them directly, so that you're acting as a kidney dialysis for both yourself and him.
David Cronenberg film.
It does sound kind of like a Cronenberg scenario. And in the situation, you find yourself hooked up to that person, and the question then is whether you're now obligated to stay connected to them for 9 months, because that's how long it'll take for him to finally have his blood cleaned and be cured. Or can you just decide at some point to disconnect and not put up with having been forced to remain connected to this guy for 9 months? There's also the variation on that where you initially agree to the situation,
right?
And
because otherwise, the first one simply can be used as a metaphor for rape, which is such an insignificant number of cases that doesn't really pertain to the conversation.
There you go. Or you consented to it, and after like a month, you've had enough, and
you've changed your
mind. You don't consent to going ahead with the next 8 months of it.
So the initial contract is signed, you've agreed, and now you've changed your mind, kind of scenario.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I mean, putting yourself personally, or imagining yourself personally in that situation, would you not feel justified in disconnecting yourself at some point, or would you feel obligated to go through the whole 9 months connected to this guy?
Well, it's less so what my personal feelings are on the topic, because my personal feelings aren't really so much.
I wouldn't say they're irrelevant, though, because they're an example of what
they aren't entirely irrelevant.
Sensibilities are. Right?
Certainly. A large part of the issue is that pregnancy is tremendously difficult on women. It is something that takes an incredible physical toll, and it is not to mention emotional and psychological as well. And a lot of people will never fully recover from that. And a lot of people don't want to pay that price. And there are a couple of instances which I think it is that you can make an argument for it to be acceptable to someone to cut those ties. Usually those involve rape or a significant threat to the mother's life, such as the example of someone being hooked up to the dialysis machine. I'm sure there'd be a loophole that now you're dying because of it. There's probably a loophole in the contract that would let someone get out. Which those are fairly logical consents that both people on either side of the aisle will make. It's usually rape and a significant threat to a mother's health. But that is one of the reasons why the issue gets so emotionally charged. Is because, one, we're talking about something that is incredibly hard and brutal and difficult on a woman's body, and the other is we're talking about the life of a child. And there's a reason that it gets so emotionally charged when we talk about the life of a child, and it's the same reason that in our entertainment and media that we enjoy, the vast majority of bad guys who are ever killed are men. And it's because there's a certain amount of emotional response that we have to different kinds of people being put in different places of distress. If someone says that, like, a man was hit by a car today, you're like, oh, that's unfortunate. But if someone says someone grabbed a baby by the ankle, swung it against a telephone post, and splattered its brains, it evokes a much more horrified reaction.
Right, we like cute things.
We like cute things, but there's also a desire to protect and take care of children. It is a very emotional kind of people that we have that response towards. And that's one of the reasons it gets so heated on both sides of it. It's a brutal thing for a mother, but it's also a child's life. I think that a woman's bodily autonomy is incredibly important, but I don't think that it trumps a woman's right to life. In particular, because a woman has to go and seek outside help for a doctor to actually go inside and hire a third party to terminate that process. I think that makes it significantly
Well, like
more
with the
difficult.
dialysis example, the violinist example, if does it make a difference if she needs the help of doctors to disconnect her from this violinist in the bed next to her that she's supposed to be attached to for 9 months?
I would say so. You're saying a woman's right to do with her body as she chooses, and then the right is to get somebody else to kill something in someone else inside of her.
Why does that matter?
Because it is someone else.
Yeah, but why? You're just repeating the assertion. So why does that fundamentally matter? Where is the distinction?
The distinction is that it's another person. You believe that a woman has a right to control her own body? Mm-hmm. I agree. What about the woman inside the woman? Why does that woman now have no rights to her own body and someone else ending its life?
I will grant the fetus the absolute right to life.
If it's a woman?
Regardless of cisnormative pronoun, gender things, it doesn't matter. It just,
why not?
Because I already made the argument. Because the person inside her doesn't have the right to use the other person's body to continue living against their will without their consent.
So you're saying that trumps the inside
that
body?
We have to make a determination about where one person's rights end and the other person's begins, if we're attributing personhood to the fetus.
Right.
But let me shift gears for a second, and let me. Do you mind if I?
It certainly feels like we're butting heads on this topic, where we both feel that one issue one element of it, once it gets down to its absolute simplicity that it can be boiled down to, mm-hmm. It's a question of which individual's rights are more important, and I don't think that's something.
It's not a matter of which ones are more important. It's what's the delineation between the two.
It's whose rights trumps the other person's rights. You can
change
it
also
however you want.
When does it trump kind of thing?
When is also a valid question. Yeah, like at what point?
Well, you would say, for example, as soon as it's born. Then the child is a child.
It's an objective child. It's objectively independent from the mother, but you're muddying the waters a little bit there. Like I'm going according to what we've determined to be, the limit of abortion in terms of the 21 to 24 weeks thing. Right? Those are the accepted limits. But let me just switch gears momentarily.
Sure.
And ask you if your objection to abortion. I was about to get those two terms reversed there.
May I ask something first? Though?
Yeah, go
do you object in all cases? Because we had brought up the idea of the rape and the danger to the...
Sure.
Or were you actually saying that it is okay? So is it okay in those extreme cases? I'm asking you personally, what do you feel?
Well, a lot of people in the pro-life camp will be willing to give that territory in so much as the rape, incest, and significant threat to the mother's life, simply as a fine, let's get rid of the edge cases so we can discuss the main one. But for my own personal individual preference, I don't. I know it's a very unpopular opinion to hold. To
so
say
you,
that if
you don't make that distinction?
I don't. To say that if someone was raped, that you should be allowed to kill the child. And I know that's a very unpopular opinion to make, but rape is a horrible, horrendous, evil act. And I think that compiling it with murder only makes things worse. The sins of the father do not fall on the son. And I don't think that a child should be killed for their parents' egregious actions.
So let me ask you, sorry, did you have a follow-up there?
Yeah, so I thought earlier it seemed like you were indicating that it was significant whether or not the mother had whether or not the mother had consented in the first place. So whether or not the mother had sex knowing that a pregnancy could result from it. So now it's sounding like that's actually irrelevant.
Well, that's why so many people want to get rid of those edge cases altogether, because then they can just talk about the vast majority, which is what's at issue. As far as my own personal preferences go, someone's right to their own autonomy and do what they will with their body does not trump someone else's right to be alive. I don't think your mother's ever allowed to kill you.
So Okay, so it's true, right, that there's inherently a risk, however large or small, depending on where you are in the world or how much money you have. There is a risk to pregnancy and to childbirth. Mm-hmm. There's some chance that death can result for the mother. Yep. So granting that, isn't there then competition now of two perfectly equal rights to life, rather than just on one side you have life and on the other side you have body autonomy?
So in individual cases where there's a very demonstrable and significant threat to a mother's life, then it comes down to the classic case of two people are hanging over a cliff. Which one do you save? And, well, that's probably going to come down to the person who's able to actually speak, unfortunately, in those cases. Simply because, as we discussed before, about a baby being killed or a man being killed, someone who's got a face that you can see generally tends to have a more emotional response. And in a case where it's just one life versus one life, logic as to the value of the life goes out the window, because one life equals one life. There's no changing that. So it becomes to what has more emotional value. And unfortunately, since the fetus hasn't lived yet, it has significantly less emotional value for a lot of the people involved.
Emotional value. Huh.
In that case,
we're deeming the emotional value, are we not? The outside is deeming the emotional value?
Well, the outside are the ones that have the power to act. So I'm simply saying that in that case, that's how I would assume people would make the choice. I'm not saying that I'm in favor of one or the other. I'm saying that in those instances in which you got to choose mother's life or child's life. In those instances, I have no particular comment or nothing to say. That's whoever has that terrible burden falls to them, has that terrible burden fall to them, and I'm thankful that it hasn't fallen to me.
What are your thoughts on contraception?
I think that they're good, and I think that they're very important for women to have more autonomy over their own sexuality, and I think that's been a large part responsible for a shift in women's rights over the last 60 to 100 years that we've seen, is women gaining control of their own sexuality and reproductive capabilities.
So why are you in favor of reproductive rights when it comes to contraception, but not when it comes to abortion?
Quite simply because now another life has been created.
Yeah, but doesn't the act of sex have the potential to create life, and therefore isn't contraception the blocking of that?
If you take a contraception to minimize those risks, but it happens anyways, then that life has still been created and now it has the rights that it normally has. Your mother's not allowed to put a knife in your head if she comes in the door right now. She wasn't allowed to do that 10 years ago. She wasn't allowed to do that when you were 6 or 6 months or 6 weeks. She never had the right to kill you, ever, because you are a human being and you are alive.
Okay, well, that's going to force me to circle back on my original argument, so I'm going to avoid doing that and change the channel slightly.
Right, sure.
So is your objection to abortion a moral objection?
Yes and no.
Okay, let's start with yes. So, do you accept... I want to understand how you define morality. So do you think that actions are in and of themselves moral by virtue of having been prescribed? Or do actions lead to moral outcomes depending on situation and context?
I think you're going to need to repeat the question.
Okay, so the question was, are actions in and of themselves moral by virtue of having been prescribed? or...
What do you mean by having been prescribed? Has been their morality comes in the fact that you've chosen to take them?
No, that's the second scenario there. But what I mean by prescribed is, are they dictated? Are actions moral because something dictates that such and such is moral or immoral? Or do actions lead to moral outcomes depending on the situation and context?
I'm still not entirely sure what you're asking.
You're asking whether consequences determine whether something is moral, and intention determines whether something is moral, or whether something can be sort of predetermined to be a wrong action to take, regardless of whether or not the outcomes are beneficial.
Exactly. What I'm really trying to get at is, what is the foundation of your morality? How do you go about determining right from wrong?
Well, that in and of itself can be an incredibly long and entire podcast in and of itself.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure.
But I can answer that question in 2 minutes.
Yes, but you've also prepared to answer it.
No, it's just I know what the root or the foundation of my morality is, and for me, it's. Do you want to get into it, or do you want to answer the question first? So the question is essentially, what is the foundation of your morality? Where do you derive your morality from, and how do you go about determining a right action from a wrong action?
Well, to be perfectly honest, my morality always will come back to my faith, but my individual faith isn't a universal morality that I apply to other people. That's a basis that I use to determine my own morality, as opposed to the morality of others.
How do you know you're right?
It's called faith, not fact. It's something that I believe in.
Isn't there any position you couldn't possibly take on faith? Is there any position you couldn't take on faith? Like, could I take it on faith that black people are worse off or worse than white people? Can I take it on faith that Jews should be killed? Because I have faith in that opinion.
I'm not entirely sure what you're conflating with the two.
Is there a position you could not take on faith alone? Like, is faith a reliable pathway to truth?
If you believe in objective truth, then yes, it is.
I disagree. Because if you can take a faith-based position on pretty much anything, how do you determine who's right and who's wrong? Like, two people can have an opinion on a given topic that they both have extreme faith in their position in. Which one of them is right?
It becomes to be an incredibly difficult question.
Not really.
Why?
Because you can objectively determine whether or not something. Let me put it this way. I'm gonna expound on my definition of morality. Okay. So if we accept well-being as the goal of morality, right? You can objectively determine which actions lead to well-being. In the same way that if we accept the goal of a game of chess as winning, or at the very least not losing, you can objectively determine moves toward that end. If we accept well-being as the goal of morality, well-being, as I understand it, is, happiness is generally preferable to sadness.
Right.
Being able to afford living is generally preferable to poverty. Then we can make objective determinations to determine what leads to that goal.
But using those metrics, would that not put abortion into the same category as genocide then? For your own preference, you've ended a life. You've ended that life, you've ended the lives that will be produced by that life, and their heirs, and so on and so on.
How is
You've
that?
taken your preference and used it to override the existence of theoretically infinite lives.
I don't understand your analogy. And
Your analogy is the ultimate greater good.
No.
Yes, of someone's well-being.
No. It's not a matter of greater good. It's about well-being, and well-being will depend on the situation.
So then morality is about maximizing well-being.
Yes.
In that case, someone being put into an uncomfortable position is significantly less valuable than someone being killed.
What do you mean by an uncomfortable position?
Pregnancy.
Okay,
Would your morality then not dictate that being pregnant is not as bad as being killed? Would that not be how your morality dictates if well-being is the ultimate end goal then? being killed
I think
ends
that's
everything.
I think that's a false analogy.
Why?
Because, again, if you're saying is being pregnant preferable than being dead, yes. So the mother being pregnant is preferable to.
I don't know that.
Well, yeah, okay, you're right. Like, is that necessarily true? I don't know. Like, there could be situations where it is preferable to be dead than pregnant. You know, if somebody is suffering immensely, and you know, if they're in a vegetative state and they're falling, their arms are gone, their legs are gone, they have no ability to do anything, they can't wake up from this coma.
Do you think that anyone off the street could come in and pull the plug for that person, or do you think that person has the right to whether or not it ends for them?
I have no idea. I don't know.
I think individuals have the right to their own lives.
No, I think if the person is plugged into somebody else, then there's one person that has the right to pull the plug, and it's the person that is. Okay, well
let's change the course of the argument a little bit on that then. In that case, what you're arguing for is viability. That someone is not allowed to take the nutrients off of somebody else's body and use that to sustain their life. In that case, once a fetus becomes viable, they still should not be allowed to kill it. Once it becomes viable, then it simply says, they say, I want this taken out as soon as possible.
I never said I agreed with late-term abortion. I agree with...
But that is the position that you're building up,
No, not at all. No, I'm just expounding on my, what I interpret as morality. Mm-hmm. And I've already agreed that, past 21 to 24 weeks, once it's been determined that viability is... the fetus is now viable, mm-hmm. then I do not agree necessarily with aborting it that late into the term, unless there's an absolutely valid reason to do so.
Certainly. But that becomes a particular problem, because viability is not a fixed point.
No, but when I say viability, I'm specifically referring to the 21 to 24 week threshold that we've imposed as a limit to abortion.
We've imposed that, but I would very strongly assume that you don't feel that human science has reached its zenith and will never move further from this point. Medical science continues to advance, and the viability of a fetus outside of a woman's body is only going to continue to grow.
Sure. But as it stands, that is where I am. I will change my I will, as always, change my opinion depending on the evidence.
At the moment a fetus is viable outside of a woman's body, it is no longer justified to kill them.
Sure.
I think that's a pretty fair point to have an agreement
so
on.
So a line has been drawn?
Yeah, that is where I draw.
I think you're still drawing a line earlier than that, though.
Oh, absolutely, I would. But that doesn't. But in the same way that Mark might agree to draw a line there, but personally himself believe that, they should be allowed to go all the way. And I can also agree to drawing a line there. Although myself, I personally believe it should go all the way in the opposite direction. The entire point of having conversations and being able to discuss things with another is so that we don't fall into sound bites of right and wrong, but so that we can discuss things in an open forum and come to agreements on things, or at least find expand our conscience on issues and subjects together.
Okay, so again, I don't want to straw man your argument, but earlier on, I can't remember if did you equate abortion with murder?
Yes,
you did. Okay, so then, what should be the punishment
for abortion?
Yeah, if we're putting it in the same category as murder, should the punishment be the same as a murderer?
Yes, but I think that law should apply to abortion doctors, not to women, because a lot of women in our society are being sold a false bill of goods that what's inside of you is mucus, it's a tumor, it's palpable to those things, that it is not alive, it is a cluster of cells.
I don't necessarily think that's what's being peddled as.
That is what
not only that, but conspiracy to commit murder is a thing too. Like at the very least, they're even though the doctor is the one actually performing the abortion, they've hired the doctor.
But they're being consistent. It's similar to like a Nazi Germany situation, where people are like, "Oh, we were doing what."
Don't go down the reductio ad Hitlerum argument.
No, I don't intend to. But the point is that our society tries very hard to convince women that no, these things don't have rights. They're not really functioning, living human beings that have rights.
And that is not at all.
But
just to clarify, just for a second, but I'll let you continue. That is not at all the position I'm holding.
Again, I'm not saying that you hold that position. I'm saying you're asking what my position would be for enacting a legal punishment for it.
Right.
And to which case I'm saying that women who are in the category in which they've been told, which I would say they're being lied to, that that's not a human being and that you can suck it out of you the same way you're sucking out tumor or mucus, that the modus operandi to commit murder is not there, because they don't even think that that's a person. But for a doctor and a medical
You mean
professional,
the mens rea?
yeah, the mens rea. But for a doctor, it's impossible for them to make that distinction, because no doctor who's performing an abortion could ever be ignorant enough to assume that that is not a living human being that they're killing. Anyway, so that is my answer to your question.
So you think the doctor is the one who should receive the punishment then?
Yes, if they're in the same way that if a doctor is willing to do a Kevorkian operation on someone when that's not based on the law, then I would agree that that's murder. If someone says, I want to die, and a doctor says, okay, and picks up that person and throws them in a wood chipper, that person might have said that they wanted to die, but the doctor is still the one that acted on it. Now, regardless of what we have law about assisted suicides, you can see that the doctor willingly ended someone else's life. Regardless of the other positions that come into it, that is still willful murder. It is the ending of someone else's life. Now, granted, it's different in that case because someone's actually asking for it. And in that case, it's a woman asking to kill someone else's life, her child. It is not the child who is consenting in that case. And so, if it's a doctor is ending someone's life who has not consented to having their life be ended, yes, I would call that murder.
Do you think it's in any way meaningful that that a fetus or a zygote or
whatever term you want to use,
a non-viable baby or whatever, that they aren't even capable of consent at that stage?
I don't find that to be a problem, no. A 2-year-old child is not capable of consent of really much of anything, aside from no, which is usually their favorite word. That doesn't mean you can throw them underneath a bus.
Sure. But
mine was why.
let's say casting it as in the comparison of two, basically comparing like the rights of two entities.
Right.
One of them has a conscience or a consciousness, has experiences, has plans, has feelings, and the other one doesn't, but
has the potential to develop them.
But has the potential to develop them.
That's a very simple question to answer. I don't believe that ageism is any result for determining value of life. I don't think someone who's 60 is any more of a valuable human being than someone who's 6 months old.
But
I think their lives both have equal value.
No, you move to a comparison of two actual persons with the same actual
Two objectively distinct persons.
feeling and consciousness and
Are you arguing that a fetus doesn't have feeling?
yes,
Because I object to that.
Yes, at some point, a fetus doesn't have consciousness, right? There's a development that goes on where it has to arrive at the capability of consciousness or feeling, right?
Certainly.
I mean, its nervous system is being
built and it's being constructed. It's a human in a state.
That's
of
what
progress.
gestation is, right? That's what.
Absolutely. But the humans continue growing for an incredible amount of their lives. The human species is significantly rare. And the fact that our gestation period continues for quite a bit outside of a womb. Human infants are basically helpless for the first couple of years, as opposed to most animals, which is a few minutes before they're able to survive on their own.
How long do whales gestate for again?
I have no idea.
I'm talking about gestation outside of the womb.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Right. But regardless of that point, it goes back again to the feeling of a fetus, and there's an interesting note to bring up on that, is that there's a lot of people in the pro-life crowd who were abortion doctors, or people who regularly performed abortions, and who've been so horrifically scarred by the things that they've done, the things that they've seen, such as a fetus floating around on a ultrasound or other things, fighting against the utensils that are being used to pull off its limbs or twist and break its body parts to make the delivery as minimal painful for the woman as possible. or when a child is born and they're struggling to survive, and then the traditional abortion medical practice is to then kill or leave the child to die of exposure. And there's enough people who've been horrified at doing this to children that they've been people who've done it all their lives and then realize this is absolutely morally disgusting and horrifying that as humans we're doing this to one another, especially in our most innocent and vulnerable states. And so as to your question as to whether or not they have, or the development of their feelings is important, they develop feelings and response to stimuli at an incredibly young age, further ahead than viability.
Okay, so if we could determine a point where they don't have it, then like where you subject it to whatever stimuli and there is no reaction, then at that point it's okay to...
No, I don't think so. I don't think that killing someone without pain makes the act any different in and of itself. So, certainly you can enhance the punishment if, let's say, you tortured someone to death as opposed to simply, I don't know, drugging them so they died in their sleep. You can probably put a harsher punishment on the first, but those acts are both still willful murder and the ending of someone else's life who did not consent to having it be ended.
So let me ask you, we're running out of time here, but just a couple of last little things. I don't know if we want to go into overtime or not on this, but...
well, there doesn't have to be a time limit if the conversation's still going.
Sure. Yeah, if we can keep going if you want to.
Well, I think when we got to an area where we did earlier where we were both stuck in a circle and neither of us were able to make any kind of headway convincing or putting different arguments towards one another, then it's useful to end in a discussion there because there's no more to be had from it. But in a situation where we both have things that we'd like to continue to add or to continue to discuss, I don't see any reason to stop unless everybody wants to.
Well, I'm curious to know where...
I forgot what my question was.
We'll try and think of it.
Well, maybe you'll think about it while Luke's posing
So, is it the direct meeting of sperm within egg that to you is the beginning of life kind of thing?
I would say that you can scientifically point to conception as being the beginning of life, because that is the point at which human DNA develops.
Yeah, and I think science would tend to agree with that.
Okay,
like,
so
there's a pretty general consensus as to conception being the start of human life. I don't think that's something that needs to be
that is the point. You can take a sperm and you can say, well, this is a piece of a human, but this isn't a human. You can take an egg and you can say this is a piece of a human, but it's not a human. Once an egg and a sperm meet and the DNA mixes, at that point you can say this is an individual human that has not existed before.
Thank you. You just brought my mind back to where we wanted to go. So what is it that determines whether or not something is human? And when you refer to human, are you speaking biologically, or are you talking more in the general sense that we understand human being to mean?
What's the difference between biologically and the general sense?
Biologically just means you can identify something based on DNA as belonging to the genus Homo sapiens, whereas
the general sense it looks like people.
No. Well, but I'm talking about like DNA being the determining factor of whether or not something is biologically.
You're right. That's biology, but what's the general?
In general,
you're talking about the versus.
Yeah, because I'm trying to avoid any kind of equivocation between person and human being and all this other stuff. So how do you determine whether or not something? First of all, are you using human to mean person? Are you saying human to mean biologically human in this context?
I think that's good. That goes back to one of the original points that you were bringing up, is a problem with using human and person interchangeably. And you were saying that it's a great philosophical thing, I think therefore I am. What is a person, right? And I think that's a particularly bizarre argument to me to make. Like if let's say a homeless person gets caught in the back of a dumpster and gets crushed to death, right? And you see someone on the 11 o'clock news be like, oh, a homeless man was crushed to death today. And you're like, no. But was he a person? And so it's like, what? And you're like, well, I don't know whether or not he was actually a person or not. You'd be like, you're a jackass, get off the news. Like, no one would pay that person any mind. And I don't see what exactly it has to do with this debate. If someone's a human being, then they're a human being. Regardless of where they are mentally, regardless of where they are physically, we go through an entire journey throughout our entire lives. We continue to grow, we continue to learn, and we collect more experiences. And a lot of people try and wrestle with those experiences. What do they mean? How do we confirm what it means to be alive, and what does it mean that we're here? But none of those questions put any kind of stress on determining whether or not someone is a human being.
It matters in the context of abortion because the argument that a lot of pro-life people make is it's a human, don't kill it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Or it's a person, it's a human, it's a person, please don't kill it. But the idea of personhood is a very loaded term. It has a lot of baggage associated to it. Whereas if you just refer to it as like, well, it's a human, do you mean biologically human, or do you mean human being, do you mean human person, right?
I don't see how the two terms are different still.
Because labels matter, right? Most of the time, whenever you're speaking about a human being, you mean person, right? But if you're just saying that based on its DNA, you can determine that it's human and therefore you shouldn't kill it, I don't think the DNA determinant is really a strong foundation to stand on, because a fingernail contains DNA.
Yes, but this fingernail doesn't contain any of the necessary qualities that we would say it is alive. And in fact, you can actually look at a fingernail and determine
Let me
that
give you another example. Scientists have been able to, using stem cells, grow a human heart in a laboratory. Completely functional, beating human heart.
Sure.
Right? It contains DNA. Does that make it human?
Okay, it makes it a piece of a human.
Sure.
But it does not make it an entire human being. Okay. In the same way that if someone chops off a hand and leaves it at a table, you'd say that's a hand. Someone says, no, it's a person. Nobody would draw that line. People would very clearly say that's a hand, not a person. And in the same way, if a very tiny person was somewhere, we'd say that's a small person. Dwayne Johnson does not have any more value Dwayne Johnson is no more human than Peter Dinklage.
Right.
Like the size of someone, the amount of them that there is, or even as I was saying before about how old someone is, the more experience they've collected doesn't make them any more or less human.
It's not so much a matter of value when it comes to is a fetus a person, as it is a matter of...
Not to interject too heavily, but it does, because it comes back to, a fetus's right to life trumps a woman's right to her own body autonomy. And the only time that the scale shifts is when you say, because like you were saying before, it's at odds of two people's rights.
Yeah.
And the rights to not kill someone is going to be heavier unless you say that someone is worth less, which is how it has to balance back.
I don't agree.
So if I can interject, so when I was bringing up potentiality and all this kind of stuff earlier, I wasn't
right. I'm sorry.
I wasn't appealing so much to age. I was appealing, or I was trying to get at what characteristics make up a human, and how many of those characteristics can you pull away to suddenly say, okay, now it's no longer a human.
Now I have to go back to the question of when you say human, do you mean biologically human?
No. I understand the point that he's bringing up. First of all, I don't.
Just for clarification.
I would go with his working definition of a
there is no difference
person /
human.
He's more working with a
cool.
There's no difference between a human being and a person.
Okay, I just want to make sure. You can
look at something and say it's part of a human.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
How many parts can we take away?
I just want to make sure that you're using human being and person as having the same meaning.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Carry on.
So like you were saying a moment ago, the beating heart, it has the DNA it has human DNA, but it's only a piece of a human.
Yeah.
And when we look at a zygote, it doesn't have the nervous system of a human. It doesn't have the fingers of a human.
But it has the DNA of a potential
somehow
human,
we can't call that a piece of a human.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point to bring up, and it's also a very interesting.
I have another analogy, but along the same lines before you respond here. So when it comes to in vitro fertilization, what they do is they take a human embryo and they remove typically like an eighth of it to determine whether or not it's viable. Yeah. Does that mean you're removing an eighth of a person then? Like, can I take away an eighth of you?
If as long as I didn't die from doing so, then I wouldn't call that murder.
I didn't say it's a murder. I'm just saying, are you taking, like, when it comes to the human embryo and them analyzing 1/8 of it to determine viability, are they removing an eighth of a person at that point? Because I
don't see why not. If I had hair that was all the way down to my ankles and constituted an eighth of my person, and someone took something that would not irrevocably harm me and used it to determine something, then I don't see why that would be a problem.
Okay, so you're saying that removing an eighth of an embryo is equivalent to removing an eighth of a person?
In so much as the amount of harm that would be done to that person.
No, it's not a question of harm or
Well,
lack
it
thereof.
is,
It's just
because
no. It's just superficially. Does that equate to removing an eighth of a person from that? Like when it comes to
Taking away an eighth of an embryo has a very low chance of actually killing it, whereas taking away an eighth of a person has an extremely high chance of killing them because of the state that they are in their development.
right, but I'm just wondering, again, superficially, if you're equating the two.
Superficially, they're still a person, and you're still taking a piece of them away. However, the amount of harm that's being done by taking a piece of them away is vastly different.
Okay. I think you were in the middle of something.
I'm wondering about the preservation of DNA. Let's say from a very, a very underdeveloped fetus.
Mm-hmm.
We extract the DNA,
Mm-hmm.
then kill said fetus. Can we say that this DNA contains still the workings of this potential human being? So is it really the death of that fetus, I wonder?
I would
If
say
that
so.
DNA
Right, if you
is-
just
is-
take what's needed to be able to clone them and continue the development.
Sure,
Is
of
it the
them.
same
If
person?
we could create a scenario where, let's say, the potentiality of this fetus does not look like it will grow to maturity, and so let's kill it, start over again.
Oh, that's an excellent question. That's a ton of fun question as well.
That is-
Actually, the other question that we were going to just to very quickly touch before answering that one was how many points can you take away from someone and them still being a human being? Like, are they a human being if you take away an arm? What about two arms? What about their legs? What about their lungs? What about their heart? And and generally the term that most people will irrevocably be like, that's the definitive one, is the brain. Is usually
Yeah,
that's
what about
that's
their
the last
consciousness?
one that people
What about
want to take
their
away.
feeling? What about
Right.
their emotions?
But going back to this one, is in the option of cloning. If you could clone someone, then does that mean that you can't kill them as long as you can continue cloning them? And that's obviously not the case. If I chop off Mark's hand and then I throw him into a wood chipper and then I take that hand and grow a new Mark, that doesn't change the fact that I killed
think
the
that's a
original
great
Mark.
idea.
I think
it
so,
may
too.
it may develop into a better mark.
I think that would be really important. A really important.
But
discussion
you
to
see
have.
what I mean? That doesn't negate the fact that I killed the original Mark just because I used a piece of him to make a new one.
Well, I have a similar
I
question
created the
along those.
scenario of it being in danger, just to sort of add another level of ethics, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that makes it incredibly interesting. Let's say Mark is in a
Why are we
situation
using me?
because it's fun.
Mark-
let's say Mark is in a wood chipper, a
Oh,
slow
great.
wood
Okay,
chipper,
cool.
and he reaches out and he yells, "Luke, clone me!" And
Alright,
you
so-
take the hand and you run away with it and clone Mark.
Okay,
right?
yes.
And maybe let's say you, just to keep the ethical situation going, that you were the one who put him in there in the first place, and then now you regret having put him in a wood chipper, and you try and save him by then cloning the arm. The original Mark is still dead. But that also just goes up the whole fun case of, what makes a person, whether or not they're consciousness, or do they have a soul, what continues after someone dies, and how much, of making someone else. Would that be the original person? Would that be a new person? Et cetera, et cetera. It's a fun thing for science fantasy, or science fiction, but there's a very strong reason why we don't allow human cloning. It's because playing around with things like that can be extremely unethical, because it is the creation of life. And specifically, human life that they're dealing with. Yeah, you can mess around with goats and pigs all you want, because we don't consider them to be human beings. We don't consider them to have the same value that a human life does. That you do
I
have
don't
it.
think that's necessarily true, because a lot of people would place the same value on animals as they do human life. The classic example I'm going to give is PETA. In fact, they value animal life more than they do human life. So, yeah, I don't.
Right. Or philosophers like Peter Singer, who are just talking about sentience as being the determinant of whether or not something has equal moral consideration.
Right, like the joke in Futurama when they decide that they can't eat sentient things, and so then at one point Bender serves them dolphin. They all go, "Oh no, but Bender, it's sentient." He says, "Oh no, it's okay. It invested in some stock, right?" And they go, "Oh no, okay, it was clearly retarded. It's okay to eat this one."
Clearly retarded. Fun fact about the hand cloning thing, that's how they cloned Luke Skywalker in the Heir to the Empire book. So they found the severed hand in Cloud City and created Luke Skywalker.
Yep, with two L's.
Yeah.
If we start talking
two
about
U's.
the Last Jedi, we're going to have an incredibly long
Yeah, I've been
here.
meaning to talk to you about
Yeah,
that.
that is
that sounds like
worth
another
it.
episode.
We'll get into
episode on
that.
The Last Jedi.
We'll
That
get
could
that later.
be the after show, but go ahead. Okay, so
Right.
I
I think
wanna
there was a
pick-
question somewhere.
Yeah, I want to pick up on the I think there might have been a question too, but I want to pick up on the cloning issue. which you kind of tangentially brought up, is if you clone somebody, is it the same person?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, how do you so how
I don't know why.
so something that occurred to me is that I'm not sure how you define murder. Are you defining murder based on the action of the murderer, or based on the ending of a life?
Or is it the legal definition?
I'm not sure what the action of the murder or the ending of the life.
So
those are the same thing.
No,
Isn't the
not
action
quite. Not
the
quite.
ending of
So
the
like
life?
with the idea of the cloning,
Right.
we sort of conceived of some kind of way in which the life isn't technically ending.
I wouldn't necessarily say that's the case, because, I mean, the life is ended, and the hand itself is not alive, but you've used that to take life from that. Which I think goes back to the original point that Luke was bringing up, is that if you have a piece of DNA and use that piece of DNA to create a human, then was the original human from which you took that DNA killed? And it's a fun philosophical thing to think over. I would argue that the original person is still dead.
And okay, so if you manage to somehow manipulate someone into thinking they've killed somebody else, even though they haven't, like, for example, there's
Holograms.
Okay, sure. Let's say a hologram.
If we're gonna go hypothetical, we might as well go all the way.
There we go. Let's say there's a hologram that's completely convincing. You think it's another person, and you kill them, but it wasn't actually a person.
Mm-hmm.
Are you still guilty of murder? Is that actually murder? Ooh. Or are you suddenly not guilty of it because it wasn't actually murder, even though you have the mens rea, you have the intention.
I think it's very simple to answer that question, and that it would fall under the exact same category in which you tried to murder someone, but were not successful, and it's just attempted murder at that point.
So, in the case of like the Westworld example, where you have an artificial.
No, wait, hang on. It's not attempted murder though if it wasn't ever a real person to begin with.
Right, that's kind of where I was going.
Okay,
but that's what I mean. Let's say you throw up a picture of Mark, and I unload into it with a
which
Glock,
we
with a
would
Glock.
do. We would what?
Yeah, and I unload it into a Glark. And I take a Glark into
A bazooka.
Yeah,
I've got a
I shoot-
bazooka.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, I take a bazooka. I see a silhouette of Mark. I take a bazooka and I shoot it, right? And then Mark pops out of a bush next to it and goes, "You son of a bitch! You're gonna go on trial for attempted murder for that because you were definitely trying to kill me." Right?
Damn right.
And I assume, wouldn't that be the logical conclusion of how that would go down?
What if you shot a picture of Mark? No.
Well, if I'm shooting a hologram of Mark,
If he shot, I guess, the picture thinking it was Mark.
yeah, because you're saying.
Oh, if you thought it was Mark, yeah.
that isn't
no,
that the-
so,
what
so
you're pointing for?
I was asking a question, actually.
Right.
I'm not sure where I stand yet.
Well, I thought the question you were asking was if someone tries to kill something that they think is human, should they still be punished under the same extent of the law as if they had successfully killed a human? Which
Yeah,
I'm
well,
saying is
and
that
not
not
even necessarily if they should be punished, but ultimately the question
that
is
the
just
same?
is that the same? Is that murder?
I think it's
because
the same.
they did the action. But even though there's no actual human life that's been ended.
So
Well,
your
I think that's
ultimate
attempted
question.
murder,
So
isn't
your
it?
question comes down
No,
to
not necessarily if it's not a real person. And it's never been a real person.
So
But
your-
if they were convinced it was,
If they were convinced it was, but it never was.
well then why is it not attempted murder? Because they were attempting to murder someone and failed. Because the person was
No,
real.
because in actuality, we only consider it attempted murder when someone attempts to murder an actual person.
Mm-hmm.
We don't charge people with attempted murder if they only think
Thought
they're
they were
murdering
someone,
something,
right.
or if they murder a picture and they think in their head that it's a real person because they're crazy or something like that. We won't charge them with attempted murder.
Well, that's because someone's crazy, which throws out a whole bunch of other problems with the legal system. But the point you're still getting at is if you try to kill someone and you fail, and you took actual actions in that pursuit, I don't see why you can't charge them with
No,
attempted
but
murder.
the distinction is that is the someone part in there. You're trying to kill something that you think is a someone, but was never a someone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. For a better example, let's say someone walks into a room and then you put up a hologram of I don't know, just like you pick a random person, or
Yeah.
maybe you generate one that's never existed before. You pop up a holographic person.
Can it be me again?
No,
because people might know you.
That's right.
This
yeah,
person
no.
might never have existed at all,
Yeah.
right?
All
You
right.
just pop up
It's a composite,
Yeah.
an imagined
A,
composite.
a composite of
Yeah.
all of us.
Yeah,
So-
and then the person tries to attack it and kill it, right? Only to then be revealed that it's a hologram. There's like the double glass opens up on the other side of like
Yeah.
Fury sitting on the other side, just shaking their head, right?
Yeah.
I would state even though they didn't know who that was, maybe they could argue, oh, it was self-defense because I was scared, right? But you could still point that you tried to kill that person, even though that person didn't exist. You were trying to end the life of another human. And you were trying to end the life of another human is enough that, as a human society, we find that to be a reprehensible act, which is why it's in our laws that we would punish a person for attempting to take those courses of action. Right?
I just remembered what my question was from half an hour ago. So, do you make the blanket assertion that killing is wrong across the board?
The ending of life is wrong across the board. So given the example of, is it okay to kill an abortion doctor if it were to end all abortions? If
Right.
this was the final abortion doctor, right?
It
Hypothetical.
actually is a very interesting hypothetical question to put forward to a lot of people who are pro-life. Are they for if... Because there are situations in which most people will say that there is reasonable grounds to kill someone. Usually self-defense, war are common ones that are brought up that almost anyone will be like, yeah, I guess it's okay to kill someone. That
Right.
makes sense. And in the case of the classic utilitarian argument of you have someone on one side of the tracks and then you have 10 people on the other side of the tracks,
Yeah,
and you have the
good.
option to throw the switch. And when it's posed to people who are pro-life, is killing an abortion doctor. If they would phrase the question is somebody walks into a playground and they have a machine gun with them and there's a bunch of kids playing. You yell at people stop, he's gonna kill those kids, and everyone ignores you, everyone thinks you're crazy, and you have a gun. You have the option to stop that person from mowing down the playground of people. Are you ethically bound to then stop that person?
Or even, are you morally justified to stop that person?
Right, and that's an entire question and conversation to have, and
Yeah.
it's a very difficult one, because for people who are pro-life, that is essentially what abortion doctors are. They're killing a significant portion of small, defenseless humans. So then, are you morally justified in stopping them from pursuing that act?
My
I'm not
was-
trying to give anyone. I'm not saying that anyone should do that. I think that killing in any fashion, even in self-defense, is generally absolutely reprehensible, and that we should do our best
Okay,
to
so
try
that
killing
was
them.
the essence of my question. Are there situations in which it is justified to kill somebody?
Right, and then of course the abortionist argument is, so why can't abortion fall into one of those categories?
No, I wasn't necessarily going down that road. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, are there situations in which it is justifiable to end another life?
Under the terms of the law, yes.
Okay, that's all I wanted to know. So, I think we should wrap it up at this point because we're experiencing tremendous technical difficulties and I don't know how long we can keep this up.
Okay.
So, in closing, I want to ask one final question, the thought experiment, and it's a variation of the trolley thought experiment.
Okay, sure.
So there's a trolley coming down the track and there's a split in it and there's a lever and you have to make the choice of whether or not it goes to track A or track B.
Certainly.
On track A you have a toddler.
Yep.
Okay. Track B you have a container of 1,000 frozen embryos and you have to make the determination of which of these two tracks the train will go on and you have no way out of this situation. Which do you choose?
Oh, this is actually an incredibly easy question to answer. I've heard this one before, and I've heard a lot of people get tripped up on it. The answer is that you pull it towards the embryos, to exterminate the embryos, as opposed to terminating the child. Now, that's a very interesting question and a very interesting answer, because what a lot of people then stipulate that to mean is, aha, you've proven that a child has more value than these 10,000 potential childs. You know that abortion is okay. But to phrase that question in another way, let's say it's my daughter, one human, or the three of you. I apologize, but I would not even think for a second about saving the three of you over saving my daughter.
Neither would I.
That does not mean that the three of you have been proven to not be human and to proven to have less value than my daughter, because it is not a decision that is based on logic, it is a decision that is based on emotion. Let me flip the situation around.
Yeah, you mentioned emotional weight, I guess, earlier in the conversation, right?
And let me flip the question around, in which you would absolutely have to answer B. You're on a spaceship. You're going to a new planet. You are the last living human, with the exception of a small boy with you. There's a fire. The small boy's in trouble. You have a package of 10,000 human embryos that is the last hope of the human race, and you have artificial womb to be able to create those humans with. Now it sucks to see that kid die, but the other is the ending of the human race.
Right.
So suddenly now the question gets flipped, and now the obvious answer becomes B, simply by changing the logic in which you would use your emotion to make that
You're
judgment.
changing the scenario. You're not changing the logic. Because the logic will dictate which one of those two options you choose.
The logic
on
doesn't change. Yes, you're right. The logic doesn't change. It's one life or 10,000
Right,
lives.
it's placing weight
Now
on
it's
a variable.
It's
Now
entirely dependent on the situation, though. The situation you're presenting is the
Mm-hmm.
survival of the human race. So obviously, by definition, you want to maximize the potential for that goal. Whereas in the first situation I presented, there is no kind of ultimate scenario.
No, I absolutely understand. And the answer to it is stormtroopers.
What?
The answer to that question is stormtroopers.
Okay.
Because you have one person or you have 10,000 people.
Are you talking about Star Wars stormtroopers?
Yes,
Can
Star
they
Wars
aim
stormtroopers.
properly?
No. See, you have one person or you have 10,000 people.
Okay.
You're making an emotional response, not a logical one. You make the emotional response, and everyone will make that emotional response because they can see a child. They see a child crying. They see a child screaming. They see it asking for help. It pulls on our heartstrings. We go to make that movement. There's a reason why in our media and our entertainment that we enjoy, when bad guys get gunned down ad infinitum, we don't explore their backstory. We don't give them a personality. We don't develop them. We don't give them any characteristics that we would think as humanizing. We put masks on them. So we don't
the stormtrooper
think of them.
effect is what
We
you're
don't
talking
think of them as people. That's why it's that's why it's so common for heroes to never wear helmets, but for bad guys to have their faces covered. It's so you don't feel bad about killing those people. And in the same way with the embryos, it's one life versus 10,000 lives, but none of those 10,000 lives have faces. They aren't pleading you for your help. They aren't calling for you. And it's, to flip the scenario, not too deeply twisted, but let's say you have 10,000 people who are hooked up to life support machines, or one child who is screaming and begging for help. You're more likely to save the one who's screaming and begging for help as the people who will never feel their death.
I would still choose the 10,000. Even in the first situation that I presented to you, I would choose the embryos.
Good.
I would derail the train with my own body, thinking they were the ones choosing to take the train.
That's not an option.
Why can't that be an option?
Because I didn't present it as an option. Neither those.
Well, I don't care about making up my own option right there.
Damn it. Okay. All right. Final thoughts on the issue of abortion. Luke, let's start with you because you haven't said much of anything.
Oh, no. Well, to me, it seems to be just a simple case of us defining things differently, drawing different lines in different places, and in a sense, developing a different logic from those different variables and the way that those variables are marked kind of thing. So we have Matt here suggesting that life begins at a different point, and so different conclusions are made, sort of thing.
Yeah, and it just seems to me that there's a lot of arbitrariness, or at least subjectivity, to where those lines are drawn. Because from the top of the show, you said that when the egg meets the sperm, then
once it becomes fertilized, right?
Then after a few days,
in 22 days you can measure the heartbeat. Yes.
Yeah. So those two things have been joined, but there's some days in there where for some reason we're not going to call that a human, even though there's the combined DNA there that's
I don't want to
creating a
interrupt
person's
your closing statement, but if you'll allow me to.
No, yeah, it's not a closing statement.
No,
Really.
but if you'll allow me to shore up the point of that, is that I believe that at conception, human life begins, and it is very difficult to scientifically argue that life has not begun at that point.
Science would just agree with you. That's a consensus already. So
and then
like
by saying by 22 days they already have a beating heart, that is simply compounding on it that it is shockingly early that life is beginning. I was using that to simply further emphasize the original point, as to putting it forward as separate evidence to be considered.
Okay. So your position was that the life begins directly right away at the combination.
Life begins at conception, and if you don't think that life begins at conception and it requires heart and brain, then, well, guess what? That's actually way earlier than people think. Is all I was trying to put forward for that point. Right. That even if you hold to side A, it's conception. If you hold to side B, it's like 22 days. Both of which are not an acceptable camp for the vast majority of abortions.
Okay.
That's what I was trying to make with that argument.
I see. Okay, that clarifies things. Okay, and for other people in the argument, the life begins when other features of a human or other characteristics of a human emerge, and then there's also sort of subjectivity about sort of an organization of rights, whether the right to life of something unthinking or faceless is worth more than the right to well-being of something with a face.
Right.
And
the problem with that is when you keep it based in science, you can get very fact-based and easily definable answers. When you keep it based in subjectivity, it could be applied to a multitude of other things. For example, it's only a human when it has brain function. Well, what about people who are sleeping? What about people who are in comas? It's only a human when it has a heartbeat. Well, what about people who have a pacemaker? What about people who need to have blood pumped through the system by something else? It's only a human when it's breathing. What about people who are in an iron lung? Do they lose their personhood? That's why I prefer sticking with the point that we can scientifically, fact-based say, this is a living human being. Because when you get into subjectivity, you can apply it to just about anything.
You can scientifically say without equivocation that it is a human being. What science is mute on is whether or not it constitutes a person. Science cannot answer that question.
I still don't think that's even a question. I still don't see the difference between a person and a human being. But I know that I don't think we'll make any headway on this. And as far as I understand
this could be another interesting topic, though, to talk about.
Right.
We can bring this in.
So are you going to make that? Is that your...
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
As for myself, and I'll wrap it up briefly here, for my position, comes back to, like I said, throughout this conversation, is that nobody has the right to force a woman to remain pregnant against her will, and nobody has the right to life at the expense of someone else's body.
Yeah, that's a...
And Matt, I'll give you the final word.
Sure. I don't think that anybody has the right to kill someone else for their own convenience or for any reason at all, regardless.
Well, that's not true. Sorry to interrupt, but you did concede that self-defense and other potential ones that we didn't make explicit.
Convenience is not self-defense.
Okay, but now that's again a subjective idea, because it can be argued that a mother ending her pregnancy is an act of self-defense, given the potential for death or harm.
But well, to that I could say someone comes at you with a pair of nail clippers and you unload 30 rounds of machine gun fire into their chest. No court would allow you to say, "Oh yeah, you're just defending yourself." No court would accept that as that's reasonable self-defense.
Okay, putting aside.
So I don't think the two can be conflated.
Putting aside such a stark example or contrast, what about just self-defense to prevent harm to yourself? Not even necessarily killed.
But just harm.
Just harm.
Is
it at all conceivable that maybe the potential of harm that might lead to death, or just the potential of some kind of bodily harm that couldn't necessarily lead to death but would lead to maiming or something like that? Right. Is any of that justifiable in performing an act of self-defense that ceases it regardless of whether or not your act of self-defense leads to the attacker's death?
I don't think that necessarily does. As we discussed before with the the option where it comes down to it absolutely is one life or the other. There's no way you can have both. Then at that point it's a terrible choice to make, and someone's got to make a choice. Which, the person who can actually talk to the doctor is probably going to win out in those kind of scenarios. But in the case of it's just any varying level of scale beneath death, then no. The only way that self-defense, killing someone in self-defense, is when you can prove that you were going to die if you didn't.
Proof is pretty difficult.
Or that you thought you would die.
Suspect that you might die.
I mean, someone runs at you with a knife and they hold it high. You having a reasonable assumption that that person intends to murder you is, I mean, that's very difficult to argue that they didn't intend to murder you if someone's running at you with a knife. Mm-hmm. So in those kind of cases, like, but maybe he didn't mean to murder someone, which is when you get cases like, oh, it's okay, you shot him, beneath the center of mass. We can possibly get away with that you intended to wing him as opposed to intending to shoot him. So, trying to prove intent is a very important thing in determining whether or not killing someone in self-defense is okay. And in the case of the fetus, I mean, obviously you can't argue for the fetus's intent to kill someone. Mm-hmm. That'd be a very bizarre scenario.
You may not be able to argue the fetus's intent to kill the mother, obviously, mm-hmm. but you can make an argument where termination of the pregnancy constitutes self-defense. Like, that is an argument that can be made.
Absolutely. And for me, that's death of the mother.
Is that the only situation in which you would justify that kind of thing?
Yes.
Okay.
So the person only has to demonstrate that they're sincerely worried about the potential for death to come out of a pregnancy.
No.
Because you can't actually prove that. At least, I can't really.
Well, then you'd have no case in a legal court, so I wouldn't agree.
But I can't really conceive of a situation in which a mother would know for certain.
Let me present one for you then.
Yeah.
A mother
we'll make this your final argument.
I don't want this to be my last going out point. Okay. Let's. You know what? I could actually. You know what? This isn't a bad one to go on. Okay. A child is having a pregnancy being the potential to kill the mother is pretty astronomically low, and it's also an incredibly difficult thing to prove. However, let's say a woman's got cancer. She's going to get chemotherapy and radiation treatment. That's going to inevitably kill a child that's inside of her. That doesn't mean that the woman getting the treatment constitutes the murder of the child. However, hiring a doctor to go and kill the child before that treatment, that would be constituting murder. So a woman pursuing her survival to the best of her abilities, as opposed to actively seeking out ending another life, is where I would draw the line in that case. Because I'll try and round this up to my ending point, that in the end, all that it boils down to is that I too am extremely, extremely pro-choice. I don't think that you can force a death unwilling on anybody. I don't think that you can force someone to end their lives, and I don't think that that anybody has the right to kill anybody else. Not mothers, not fathers, not doctors. A human life is a human life, and that is ultimately sacred and paramount.
This has been Critical Junction, episode 45. I'm Mark.
Oh, I'm Luke.
I'm Jill.
Thanks again to Matt for being here. This has been an extremely fascinating conversation, and I hope to do it again sometime. It'll probably end up on Facebook again.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I love the fact that we can actually talk about things in civilized debates. I feel too much of our society gets down to clickbaity things and straw-manning each other, and it's part of the reason why there's been such large partisan divides in our societies. Not enough people are willing to talk with people they disagree with.
Right, and that's one of the reasons why we do this show.
That's why I'm glad to come onto it.
As always, thanks for listening, and until next time, keep thinking critically.